3, 2, 1. Hey everybody, welcome to the ESOU Podcast, number 37. Today we have a very special guest, and our special guest is Loremaster Michael Zenke. If I mispronounced your last name, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's alright.
Yeah.
It's a Zenke.
Zenke, okay.
I'm a very chill thing to open the door with.
Okay.
That's my vibe.
All right, and joining me as always is Olibeau, and this time we also have two additional guests, our kind of own ESOU lore experts, Anonnex and Audens. How are you guys doing today?
I'm good.
I'm good.
Okay. All right, so pretty exciting because I have a couple burning lore questions. I'm sure Audens and Ce-Nex also has questions too, and Ollie apparently doesn't know anything about the Elder Scrolls lore.
I don't think I've ever read a quest in my life.
Okay.
But I'm willing to learn. I'm excited.
All right. But yeah, let's start off actually. Could you, Michael, could you introduce yourself and what your job is for those of you for those people who don't know exactly what Loremaster is and who you are and what you've done?
Absolutely. So I am Loremaster for Elder Scrolls Online specifically within the organization. I kind of liken myself to like a bard. I'm the ultimate support class. When quest designers or artists or animators or whatever have a question about this like big sprawling complicated IP that we all work on, I'm a resource they can tap to help kind of give them context for all the stuff that's out there so far. I'm in a lot of meetings talking to folks about, upcoming plans and like stuff we're going to make. And I try to make myself available for any question, no matter like kind of how obscure or wacky is out there. It's a very interesting job. I don't have like a set day. Every day I show up to work, it's a little different, and I'm focused on slightly different things. But I've been a writer in the games industry for over a decade now. Worked on franchises like Destiny and Ghost of Tsushima, and so this is like an interesting evolution of my long and sort of weird journey in the games industry. So.
I did not know you worked on Ghost of Tsushima. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed that game a lot.
It's a great game.
Yeah, it is. Let's see. Do you guys have any questions about anything Michael's said?
Not really. Not myself. I think it's interesting that you worked on Destiny because in the very latest expansion, Necrom, I see a little bit of Destiny, especially in the deeper lore side, in Apocrypha, especially.
Yeah, definitely. They're both franchises with like big sprawling narratives, right? It's fun stuff.
I mean, how do you keep all that encyclopedic knowledge? Like, do you have to research things? You must do, right?
Absolutely. I do not like it. I believe Lawrence Schick back in the day played a game of Stump the Loremaster, and I don't think I would sign myself up for something like that. I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of the franchise. The way that I sort of frame it more is like I have a really like sort of vigorous knowledge of like the hot, steamy like 40% that like comes up quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And then I know about like the hot button stuff that is like, we should talk about that. Like we have those kinds of conversations, right? Like, a lot of time, just like with any sort of writing job in the games industry, it's about problem solving, right? I'm in the room to help people solve narrative related problems. And so like a lot of the reps I've done in the industry previously, a lot of the like types of work I've done on other products, and even on Elder Scrolls Online the first time I was here, like that experience really helps with having the kinds of conversations I have in my day-to-day job.
Oh, you mentioned...
I would imagine...
Sorry,
go ahead now.
No, go on, please.
Oh, I would imagine with how centric the series is to the lore, practically everything must come to your desk at some point, doesn't it?
I guess in a way, I'm very much... I am like I said, I'm a resource more than like a decision maker, generally speaking. Like sometimes I call it being fun police. Sometimes I do have to be fun police and be like, hey, there's stuff that we probably, avenues of approach that we usually shouldn't, that we shouldn't try to like explore. But every time that kind of a conversation comes up, what I try to do is I'm like, how can we maintain the core element of what you're excited about? How can we maintain the idea that you're passionate about and transition it into a space that's like more fruitful, right? That's a lot of the conversations that we have.
Yeah, from what I recall, in Vegas, we talked a little bit about that and how difficult it could be, for sure. Also to manage, people's expectations, probably, right? In terms of
sure, but one of the fun parts of working at ZOS is like I work with a bunch of really talented, like pretty smart people. So like generally speaking, by the time I start to have conversations with folks about like a piece of content or like maybe like a product we're gonna do, like a lot of times they've done all the work up front. Like they know what the lore is, they know what to plug into, and it's just like, hey, I just want to get your like sense of like, are there opportunities here that we should explore? Like that's another type of conversation to have quite a bit. Because yeah, I want to make it very clear, I am not like the only guy in the building that cares about lore. Quite the opposite. Like everybody who works on Elder Scrolls Online is like hugely into the lore, like really invested. It's a really pleasant place to be in, because whenever we have conversations about the lore, I kind of know up front that people are bought into that conversation before it even kicks off the ground, which is great.
Do you get like any special things as a Loremaster? Like, do people call you Loremaster, or do they call you by your name? I'm always kind of curious. Hey,
generally people call me Zenke.
Okay.
Thankfully, I make the joke, right? If your mom names you Michael, she names you anything but Michael. So usually people just call me Zenke. Anytime people are like, it's the Loremaster, it's usually they're usually trying to get a rise out of me. So it's like, yes, let's invoke the Loremaster and see what the old idiot in the corner has to say, right? Like, it's no. It's great. It's sort of like you were referring to. I get to be a fly on a lot of walls, which is an interesting place to be in, I guess.
It's an interesting dichotomy, though, right? Like you're in the technological aspects of creating a video game, but then you have this archaic title of Loremaster.
It's very unique. I don't think there's a lot of titles like out there on LinkedIn or whatever. I kind of the role in a way, the way I've tried to explain it to other people when I talk about it, like to people that don't know what I do generally, is there's a role in the games industry called like principal writer, which is sort of like senior writer plus essentially, and that's kind of what I do. Where I like tank. The Arcanist is a great example, right? Like I tanked the narrative stuff for that, for a class, right? And I've been doing this a while. Like I've got a lot of, like we talked about, I got a lot of sort of knowledge of the setting, and so like I was sort of an appropriate person to help shepherd that along. So that's the kind of stuff that I do in a nutshell.
Okay.
We were doing some research prior, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you started working at ZOS in 2011?
That sounds about right, yeah.
So you were there pretty much for a lot of the initial conceptual stuff.
I mean, I wouldn't quite say it that way. The game was pretty far along by the time that I got there, but for reference, the game was not a fully voiced game by the time that I joined the project. We transitioned to VO after I joined the project. So, yeah.
So did you join when the more cartoony WoW graphics were still happening, or was it after that?
I would say it was sort of as that was transitioning out. Yeah.
Cool.
And we kind of touched on this already. The Elder Scrolls as an IP is nearly like 3 decades old now, which makes me feel old. What's it like helping to shape such a well-respected and dearly beloved setting?
There is a lot. Okay. There's a lot to it. The biggest thing that I try to do when I think about how much water there's been under the bridge is just to try to look at opportunities, right? Because there's a way of looking at, like you said, 30 years.
Right.
It's like, it can be intimidating, but I think the way the Bethesda and ZOS have we've set ourselves up for success is by grounding a lot of stuff inside what we call the unreliable narrator. It's a narrative like construct that I think we talk about a lot when we do interviews and stuff. But basically what it means, right, is the only things that the player experiences as canon, the only things that I would say abstractly are canon, are the things that the player sees and does in the game world, right? So when you played Skyrim, you know, you kill Parthenax. That's canon, right? When you play ESO, right, if you played through the High Isle expansion, right, you fought against the Ascendant Lord. Like, that's real. That's about as real as it gets in Elder Scrolls lore. Everything else, and I mean almost everything, is something that someone says to you, right, out loud, or you read when someone has written that down. And as we all know from the real world, right, like, people have points of view. People lie. People say things that they think are true, right, that they believe are true, but aren't. And so that conceit is like super powerful because it lets us. Some people might see it as like a free check for retconning, but I think it's much more about like trying to look at the heart of what exists in the lore and find opportunities to tell new and interesting stories based on what's out there, right? Like Necrom's going to be a great example. The city itself is something that's been in an Elder Scrolls game before, but I would say maybe not in a lot of detail, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Apocrypha obviously has been at the forefront of an Elder Scrolls release before, but we're taking a very different. We're like kind of moving the frame, right? Like a considerable, like 45 degrees to the left, and like looking at a different part of Apocrypha, a different setting of Apocrypha. And then you look at something like whole cloth new, The Arcanist. Like, I really wanted to pull on almost our own lore, like Elder Scrolls Online's lore, from how we presented the other classes, right? The other classes, and I've said this in a bunch of like Loremasters archives now with other people's voices, but like I see Elder Scrolls Online classes as like different types of magic that we as people kind of like put a bounding box around so that we can like self-identify in some fashion, right?
Right.
So an Arcanist is just a particular type of like magic using person, right? That's really like the really reductionist way to describe it. But that draws from a ton of stuff from out in the lore and things we've said previously in both ESO and other Elder Scrolls games. And so it's all about new opportunities, right? Like Necrom itself, Apocrypha as a setting, The Arcanist, it's all taking older stuff and finding new ways to mix and match and provide new context, new things that people could say to you that might or might not be true.
Okay. I really do enjoy the fact that you brought up the whole thing about the unreliable narrative, or at least people's perceptions affecting, I guess, your view of what may have happened, because it does happen in real life a lot. So I work in the field of history, and what we often have to do is usually when we go through first-hand accounts of what the events transpired as, or what they write about, we have to also look at why they wrote those things, or why they said those things, and when, and how that actually gives us an understanding of what was going on, rather than just taking at face value. Right. And I really enjoy that, and I think it's kind of related to a common complaint that's brought up. I think it also was brought up during Vegas by someone during the Q&A, that something about map inaccuracies. And I think it was brought up when Imperial City DLC came out, like, oh, the map is rotated 45 degrees off. And I really like, as much as maybe some people might think it's a cop-out, I do really like the answer that maps are unreliable as well, right?
Absolutely,
and
right?
it's also true in history. Like, maps are very unreliable, or just based on politics, or, you know. So that's really cool. And yeah, it makes it feel more alive, at least to me.
Yeah, anytime you look at a map, right, especially like something that shows like a political boundary, like that wasn't made for you. That was made for someone else, right? That was made for someone else's benefit. And so like I completely, and I want to frame this as like, I don't want to ever come off as I'm like, the stuff you guys are complaining about it doesn't matter to me. Of course it matters to me. Like I take that stuff seriously. I just want to, give the frame for how we like look at this stuff, right? When people very rightly so, had like, hey, the last map we have this part of the continent, right? When we're talking about the Telvanni Peninsula, there's some pretty clearly defined political boundaries here. You guys don't seem to be talking about that or respecting that or anything like that. I want to make sure that people understand like why that we're taking that approach, and it's not just like an arbitrary decision. It's something that we thought about, and we applied sort of a methodology, like a framework, to that structure in that space. So yeah.
So you said a little earlier that like you dismissed it. It's like an opportunity for retcon, right? Like, and while I do think that's kind of silly to say, oh, they just keep it unreliable so they can change everything. I personally think that this is actually an interesting thing to be able to do. Like, a lot of the lore is not completely set in stone.
Right.
So you could say one thing, it seems mostly established, and then later on down the line you could say, but this would also be cool, you know? Like, maybe it would be more interesting if it was this. And either could be true. Like, an example would be the whole jungle Cyrodiil thing that people are still mad about. There are several explanations offered, and they're all cool, but it could be any one of them, depending on who you're asking.
Right. Anytime it comes down to, like, a person, you were describing, right? Like, when you write down your experience, people are very fallible, and so the way the things they choose to write down and the reasons they write them down and how they frame the experiences they had, it nets out a lot in the historical record, right? It's one of the things I love about Elder Scrolls as a franchise. I'm definitely not professionally, but I'm a big fan of history. I'm a man of a certain age now, right? So like I listen to Dan Carlin quite a bit, hardcore history, right? So like the thing that I love about his approach is he takes a very sort of people-focused viewpoint. What is the experience of people in these moments in history? How did they live? What was their lived experience as they beheld history unfolding before them? And that is I think very similar to our experience as players in an Elder Scrolls game, right? Like when we step foot in Skyrim during the time of the dragon attacks, right? Like we're seeing history play out in front of us. We get to, because it's a video game, we get to like influence how it plays out. Like that's one of the really exciting parts of Elder Scrolls games in general, I think. And that's one of the things I love about how the lore interacts with the gameplay. It's great.
I remember the lead designer for Morrowind, Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, Ken Rolston, once said that there's the king story, there's the farmer story, and then there's the dog story. And I'm paraphrasing, but I wonder, like, when you guys write these stories, do you guys create like the king story, the farmer story, then the dog story, and then decide, you pick parts of it and then decide to publish those in the game?
That's a great question. Kind of. The way that we definitely approach things, and I think we've talked about this sort of in other venues too, is like we come up with a big kind of overarching pitch, right, for whatever the release is going to be, and then we drill down from there in terms of like what we call it the main quest, right? What the main quest is going to be. Silver and High Isle, right? It's the fight against the Ascendant Lord and that experience. Below that, like underneath that, there's a huge possibility space, right? For what is the farmer's experience? What's the dog's experience? What's the weird fawn experience? What's the experience of the Khajiit spy, right? Like the game as a setting is so open-ended that we could almost do anything. It's like it's a good problem to have, right? So when we define the main quest, when we define the place we're going to go, like geographically within a release, it really helps us to drill in on what those like kind of more nitty-gritty stories are going to be. A lot of times what we do is we try to like narratively prop up any sort of like core notions we have in the main quest. Maybe there's like a fun throwaway concept that we want to hit in the main quest that we don't have time in that storyline to really flesh out. So that might end up being its own objective, right? We might end up shifting that off to be its own stand-up story with its own characters like associated with it, or maybe a character from the main quest goes off and has like a side adventure. As you guys have seen, over the many releases of Elder Scrolls Online, we've tried to shift how the main quest interacts with the world and the space and the zone. And, all the time we're having those conversations of like, how should we line up this story, in terms of beginning, middle, and end? Because, you go all the way back to launch, right? We literally did a story that started, say at the beginning of Kynarthi's Roost and ended at the end of Reaper's March, right?
Right.
And then everybody went off to Cold Harbor. That's not really what we do anymore. We try to do things in a bunch of different ways. And so just like we frame that narrative structure for the main quest specific to the release, I think we do the same thing with like the farmer story, the dog story. What makes sense? What's like a really interesting nugget from this region or this culture to rise to the top and give them their own space, right? I think my favorite thing that we've done sort of recently on that is like the island of Amenos, which is like such a weird microculture in like the broader tapestry of Tamriel. And I think we got to tell some really interesting stories about that tiny little island and its like weird population and how it interacts with especially history. Like talk about like a weird historical artifact. Like Amenos is great for that kind of stuff.
Sure.
I think that is, for me personally, one of the more appealing sides of Elder Scrolls. That it reflects the real world so much, and that you have these microcosms of cultures that connect to greater cultures, and that it just branches out, and then you can. It feels very organic,
right?
The whole setting. I imagine that takes a lot of planning on your guys' parts to make it all work together.
It does, but again, everybody in the building, right, is like very passionate about this stuff, and so a lot of times, intentionally, like when the story for a zone is just one page, a lot of that stuff is sort of not explored in that page on purpose, because leadership knows, folks like Bill Slavacek, Rich Lambert, Jeremy Serra, they know that the designers and writers on the team are just gonna like get in there and get really psyched up and find the incredible like opportunities that exist within a zone's framework. That's kind of how we approach it.
I think that's
not to get off topic or go on a tangent, but earlier you brought up Khajiit Spine. I just wanted to get this out of the way. But is it true that you were the one who designed and brought to life Razumdar?
Well, again, I am just one guy. I was the first writer to sort of coalesce Raz as a character, but as happens with every character in Elder Scrolls and pretty much every video game you're ever going to play, Raz is a bunch of people, right? Like, he was the designers that were working with me on the Olibeau Dominion, incredible group of people. And then over time, even before we shipped, Raz was... I always think of characters as being able to solve problems for writers. Like, that's... I mean this in the most kindest... like nicest way. I hope other writers who hear me say this, like on some level agree with this, but characters are tools, right? Characters are a unit within the narrative that allows us to solve problems. And so Raz solved a bunch of problems for me. And then it turned out that for people like Zach Bush and Tracy Seamster and Rebecca Harwick, who are the other writers on the Olibeau Dominion, Raz was very useful for them as well. And so he ended up showing up in a couple of other pieces of content. People liked him in the building. He ended up in more content. Like, that's kind of how that kicked off. So yes, I was the first writer to write Raz because, I don't know, I wanted to write a spy. like it was. I'm pretty sure I tooled him up for right off the bat in Vocal Guard when you're dealing with the Queen, and that whole it's where we're picking the Veiled Inheritance narrative up for the first time. Having a spy on hand to do stuff was like super useful. And then he ended up, being kind of a multi-tool. And then I make the joke, I was working with another company when the Somerset cinematic dropped. I sat there and I watched it, and it was awesome. And I was like, oh man, my boy has a more successful career than I do now. This is amazing. Look at him. Look at how great he looks. My beautiful red hair boy. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think it's a wonderful segue actually into a question.
Can I ask the next one, Nephis?
Oh yeah, go for it. Sure.
Fourth question. Okay, so, I promise this is relevant, but I love Imperials. I love Imperial lore. I know that's like normie. They're humans. It's fantasy, but one of my absolute favorite things in ESO was the reveal and Scalebreaker of Chevalier Renaud, a character who was mentioned like literally 2 times ever. So our question is, how do you, like, what's the process like of getting these little pinpricks of lore, like these little nuggets that fascinate people, and spinning them out into their whole concept into the game?
So in that particular case, I did literally just look them up, so I make sure I'm not talking out of my butt. Like, this is a great example of where there's a bunch of like pieces lying around on the table, right? And we take this thing and we take this thing and we put them together and make delicious peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like that is an approach that I have found super successful. In particular, I work a lot with the folks that work in the Crown store, and that's been like a lot of fun trying to find, you call it like blue ocean and like tech stuff, right? Like what's the untapped potential? What's a place that people haven't gone to before? Narratively, same thing, right? Like how can we find something that we've mentioned in an offhand way, combine it with something else we've mentioned in an offhand way, and spin out something like lovely and wonderful and new. It's actually the best example I can give for you right now that's sort of contemporary to our conversation is the Telvanni in this release that's so heavy on Apocrypha, right? Like I think we talked about it in Vegas, but Mora and the Telvanni and all of that being in the narrative was all secondary. It was all a knock-on effect of the core like pitch that leadership like coalesced around. Like, what if there was a secret so dangerous it could unmake reality? And because of the Telvanni's role as secret keepers within sort of mortal ken, and Apocrypha's role in the Daedric realms as like the heart of all secrets, and Hermaeus Mora as his tentacular role as Daedric Prince of Secrets, like bam, 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 right? Like just down the line. And now you have this beautiful new like melange of characters and settings and opportunities that has never existed in the lore before, but all come together from that one point, right? From that one sort of fixed thing. That's what makes ESO lore so great, is like I can throw a rock and hit a good idea, right? Like, hey, we want to tell this kind of story. Oh, here's like 4 different ways that we could tell that story based on the stuff we've already got out there. It's sometimes a hard job, right? Because it's a job, but man, it is a job that I really enjoy. I'll be really honest with you, because there's just so many opportunities out there to do stuff like this. So it's a great question, a great framing, right? Like from a pinprick of a single idea, a dark secret, an incredible secret. We have all this material, all these characters and settings that we can pull from that one core nugget and bring it into something else.
I will say, though, from a lore nerd's perspective, when you guys do these things, when you take those small, it's almost insignificant bits of lore and just spin full narratives out of them, like, it excites the hell out of us. I remember when Elsewhere, in 2019, Elsewhere was dropping and the Wrathstone came out. And then there was a bunch of us on RTS lore, and we're like, oh, that's from Arena. The tablet that you need to find the Halls of Colossus, it was from Arena. And we lost our minds over it. Like, a lot of us actually went back to Arena. Like, we tried to find our floppy disks or get some sort of emulator on our computers for Windows 95 to replay it, to re-experience it all. And it's amazing. And like Audens brought up, when Chevalier Renaud, again, in that same year came out, for those of us obsessed with the Talosmith, it was mind-blowing. And I just want to say, like, we appreciate it so much that you guys do this and just blow it out and just paint these amazing narratives for us to enjoy.
And I want to say real quick, when the Dreadseller came out and the main NPC was a battle mage from the Battlespire, I was over the moon. I thank you so much at Zenimax for doing that. I feel like it was for me. I love Battlespire so much.
I have a question. Does your computer even handle floppy disks? that's like the first thing I was thinking of.
No, but like I went to
disk.
find them. I remember just out of sheer nostalgia, I went to go find them.
I didn't realize Wrathstone was in the previous game. That's pretty cool.
So
I learned
was.
something new today.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And
I love when arena stuff comes up. It's so great.
And what's
like a Thurvokun coming out of nowhere in 2016, 2017.
Wait, Thurvokun was also a thing?
Yep.
Celine was also from Arena.
Yep.
Celine?
Yep.
Celine was in Arena. She was featured in Arena.
I did not know this as well. Okay.
They, Fangler, Arena. Fangler was actually mentioned, I remember, in the King Edward novels. And it was just, there's so much that they do, like you guys do, that just flashes out like these, from things from like, again, like almost 30 years old now. And it's phenomenal to see that you just continue to breathe new life into it and just write these amazing narratives.
It's great fodder.
Yeah. And what's the deal with Renault? I'm just asking for me and Ollie because we're like, ugh.
Okay, so Chevalier Renault is his first mention, I believe, is in Remanada, which is a text that describes the birth and ascension of Riemann Cyrodiil.
Okay.
So he's mentioned at the end as it's implied that he's a Seichi from Akavir, but he is mentioned in the second chapter as a key figure in the later ascension of Talos. It's like a sort of a bridge between Riemann and Talos, two great emperors, right?
Okay. So he's been around for a long time.
Yes, he's been around for, I think, since Mr. Michael Kirkbride wrote Remanada
in 2008 or 2009.
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
When what was it? It was the
Knights of the Nine.
Knights of the Nine DLC. Yeah.
Yes. And he showed up in Scalebreaker, which I'm sure you and Ollie both know, as the quest giver in the one with the gargoyle
and the
that
vampire.
I don't remember the name of.
Yeah.
No, it was
and his vampire buddy.
Moongrave Fane. Moongrave Fane.
Yes, Moongrave Fane. And
which, by the way, fantastic dungeon. So
it is also implied further through that quest, but not confirmed, which I love, that he is and always was a Seichi immortal shapeshifter guy.
Huh.
And it was just amazing to see him.
Okay.
Like as an actual physical figure from like someone who's so understated but so important.
Interesting.
Characters that have been around since the first era, right? Characters that have been around like for a very long time. They're a really unique opportunity, right? Because you can have them put a voice, but again, right through that unreliable narrator filter, right? Like everything that he says, everything that comes out of his mouth is just like his opinion, man. You know, so like while theoretically he does have like this treasure trove of lore from, you know, potentially many years of history, the filter through which you experience him, the stuff that he says, right? Like everything is with that bias. Everything is from a point of view. And so while, you know, he's a great character, right? And he like it's a great opportunity. I also love it because it doesn't, down the line for us or Bethesda or anyone else making stories in the Elder Scrolls franchise, having characters like that show up doesn't necessarily bind our hands to do things to counteract the things that he says because of that framework, right? It's a little bit of getting your cake and having your cake and getting to eat it too. It's lovely.
In terms of what you were saying earlier about just throwing a rock and it hitting something good no matter what, is that something like that happen as well for Necrom, the process of bringing these little pinpricks of lore?
Absolutely, right? Like I said, Necrom, obviously we've sort of been there in terms of a previous Elder Scrolls game, but a lot more detail this time, right? Like a lot more nuance to it, and obviously there's a lot of wonder to the bridge in terms of the Dark Elves for us. We did an entire other release about them, having the opportunity to go back to this region, to experience this incredible biome again, to get the incredibly weird critters back on screen, but do it in a new kind of way. CJ Greb, when he's our art director, whenever he talks about this stuff, he gets very excited about the opportunity to sort of paint with new palettes. Obviously, Tamriel tends to sometimes be a little bit more like dour. You know, it's got a bit of a gray to it. So, like in particular on this part of the continent, getting to introduce a little bit of new color into that Vardenfell red, like that beautiful smoky, you know, backdrop is like a great opportunity. And then the Telvanni themselves, like, egotistical wizards make for good stories, right? Like it's just you know, you just kind of wind them up and just watch them go, and it's cake. It's wonderful.
So the thing with the Telvanni is the Dunmer, like as you said, like very well explored, very well documented, very beloved in the community, and they're very spiritual culture. But then I believe the word used within the lore itself is the Telvanni are iconoclasts.
Right.
Very irregular, very non-traditional. How did you transplant those characters within the settings of, okay, we have Necrom, which is one of the holiest cities in the Dunmer culture. How do you transplant these almost alien-like Dunmer into this place?
A great question. So Tom Murphy was the zone lead for Necrom, and his goal was very much about making sure to put that alien experience, put that sort of strange, like on screen and in your face, right? So Necrom itself, as a setting, the city itself, existed from before the Dark Elves were Dark Elves. A beautiful opportunity to explore their ancestor culture from basically the deep past, essentially. The way that we translated that was by taking, you know, again, I've talked a lot about the opportunities that exist within the lore. Did a lot of reading, you know, took a lot of notes on sort of what the Chimer cared about, the diaspora that happened across the continent, how early Dark Elf culture tried to like differentiate itself from people that had come before it, and coalescing that into something sort of coherent and beautiful and ancient and weird within Necrom through the amazing art of the world builders and that team. I think it's a really, I don't know, man. Early in your journey, you get to meet a character, a prelate of the Keepers of the Dead, who are the protectors of the city, and his characterization is wonderful for a variety of reasons. He as a character kind of goes on a journey over the course of the main quest, which is fantastic. Very well written character by Rich Baker. But the stuff that he talks about, if you get a chance to talk to him in sort of optional conversations and stuff, where you can dig into his view on death and ancestor worship and what the city itself means, to me, that's like a great distillation of the opportunity we have. Like, you know, we're all used to the cultural tropes of the real world and how that stuff is manifested over thousands of years of human culture. Getting a chance to like dig into the brains of like literal alien beings. The Dark Elves have a very different moral fabric than we do. It's just a great opportunity, and so I hope that comes through when you play. Like, I hope when you get in there and walk the streets of Necrom, you get to see kind of what Tom had in his head when he sat down to describe this zone for the first time, because I think it's incredible. I think this is, when I read the description of the zone for the first time, I won't lie, like I literally turned around and I said to my boss and I said to Tom, like, this is the coolest thing we have ever done. I am so excited to work on that. Like, you know, I came back sort of early in High Isle was like sort of coalesced as a thing, but it was still in early days of development. And I've played all the other releases, and I'm genuinely, I think this is the coolest thing that we've done in Elder Scrolls Online. Period. It's dope as hell.
You know, I've always said that, like, to people asking questions about, you know, is ESO worth playing for the story, or like, does it do Elder Scrolls right? And I've always said that ESO is extremely good at showing the day-to-day lives and cultures of Tamriel And I gotta say, Necrom is another hit in that regard. Like, I love, like most people, finding more about Dumber, and Necrom delivers, I gotta say.
Thank you for mentioning that. Like, I strongly encourage folks when they play, obviously there's a bunch of great content to do, and you should do it. But like, I really think the world builders have like gone way above and beyond this time. There's so many very specific assets that were created to prop up that sense of life you're talking about. Give yourself a chance just to sort of like go on slow mode and just walk through the streets and like listen to the ambient chatter, right? And just look at all the there's so much little like bric-a-brac that they set out because people are leaving little offerings for their ancestors, right? And like these guys, ever since the game shipped, the world builders have been telling stories just as strongly as me or any of the other writers or any of the designers, right? And so all the world builders, when they get in there, they tell these little tiny micro stories with like, there's a little teddy bear next to like a little plinth in a corner of Necrom, and you just know, right, that the ancestor that whoever was worshiping was like a young child, right? And what kind of like conversations would you have with your great not grandmother, but like your ancestor who's in that region, right? Like near your great grandmother, who's a tiny child, right? What kind of conversations would you have with that person? Like, I love that stuff. It really speaks to what sort of alien cultures can be like, very just weird for the sake of weird. And I think that's one of the things that differentiates Elder Scrolls cultures is they have that truth to them.
I think that's definitely one of the things I enjoy the most about the Elder Scrolls Online. These seemingly almost innocent, almost irrelevant details that when you actually look at them, they paint something much greater, and that even though it's just a small tiny cog, when it moves you can see the whole entire machine move with it. And also these tiny details that, again, for us lore nerds, when we look at them deeply, we realize, oh, there's some incredible depth here. Probably one of my favorite things that was done, one of these small details, was Sanctum Ophidia, the trial. You guys named the quest The Oldest Ghost. And immediately I went, oh, the Void Ghost, the Serpent Constellation, Vivek's Sermons. And then I remember, it was the second or third time I did Sanctum Ophidia, way back years ago. I looked at the door, the entrance to it. And then there's these two serpents on the door. And then behind the two serpents, there's a dragon. I'm like, oh, that's the dichotomy of Akatosh and Lorcan on the doors. And that's such a small detail, but that just speaks entire volumes to the deeper lore. I was like, wow, that's an amazing thing. Like, that's not something I would have, like, we often talk about developers and just how they come up with these ideas, but that's not something I would have ever conceived. And honestly, hats off to all of you.
Yeah, it's like I was saying before, like everybody, and when I mean everybody, like the QA folks, the artists, the animators, everybody's just as invested in making sure that the Elder Scrolls as a franchise is represented by the work we do as me or someone in a leadership position. Absolutely.
One of the greatest sources for the little tidbits of lore, that start building the puzzle piece is and has been the little stealing items.
The
like that you pick up with.
yes.
Yes, there's like thousands of them, and every single one of them has a little lore blurb attached to them, and literally every single one of them is just a tiny story about life in Tamriel. They are all amazingly written. I'm glad that they continue to be made.
Oh yeah, man. No, it's one of the sort of the fun tasks the writers get to take on when we shift into a new piece of content. Because you're right. Every time we do a new drop, we always flesh out some new contraband, we call them steelies, some new things to steal. I genuinely think my most successful writing I've done for the game ever is a steely, which is erotica for werewolves. Of course.
What?
That's a classic one. That's one of the first ones.
A very specific tract for a very specific clientele, right? Like, good stuff. Gotta live around.
I love them. I love them so much.
I think those are...
Michael, I feel like you're the sort of Herodotus of Elder Scrolls. That's what it feels like.
I think that's a really...
like, I log on to one of my necromancers. To this day, I still have the Clockwork Jigalag effigy.
Oh, sure.
Saved. Because I remember when I first did it in game, I lost my mind. I'm like, oh my god, they actually mentioned him. It was just amazing to me.
I keep a red squirrel paw on my main, just as a lucky charm. Gotta have the red squirrel.
And my favorite one is the Mock Turtle Scoot, because I love Battlespire, and just seeing the Mock Turtle mentioned at all is just, it makes me giddy, Like,
Again, it's these tiny,
much larger than it should be.
These tiny details you guys put in that just,
Yeah, we love them.
yeah, just absolutely, these morsels, they're just so amazing. They add this flavor to the game that I've never played in any other MMO, and I've played MMO since '98. I think EverQuest was the very first one I played. Yeah.
I would assume these are pretty also reliable ways to get lore in, apart from voice lines, because from what I know, voice lines take up a lot of space in the game. Isn't it like 40? I think Ce-Nex and I were talking about this the other day. It's like 40 gigabytes of the game.
It's 33, 35.
33, 35. Okay, that's still a lot. So I think that's a pretty cool way of inserting more lore, apart from dialogue. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or just straight books.
Exactly, right? Like, we were talking about before, like, that sense of, like, living in the world, right? Like, of actually being a person. I absolutely agree. I think the Steelies are a great way to, like, you can pick up an object and read the little blurb, and, like, yeah, it's like just a quiet moment in someone's life at some point, right? Like, good or bad, right? Like, some of the Steelies imply that something terrible has happened, and some of them are just, like, I think they're very sweet. Like, stuff like a stuffed slowed plushie or whatever, right? Like the stuff that says about the world and about, like, the stories that we as people tell our children, and how we interact with stuff that frankly is terrifying, right? Like,
right.
I love that. That's like a quick mini. It's just tiny story in one little item, and I love that.
Man, I should start stealing more.
Steer the conversation a bit back towards Necrom.
Right.
Every year, Audens, Nephis, and I have this little bet. Where we're going next? Where we're going next? And every year, Nephis fails and says, "It's a red guard. It's red guard."
Okay, it's not every year.
I think my bet was Bosmer this year.
It was like 1 year. Come on.
It was 3 years in a row.
It was not 3 years in a row. There's no way.
Yeah,
it was.
And then when you guys announced Necrom, first off, we were very surprised, pleasantly surprised, because was it 2017? You guys went to Morrowind, and we did Varandenfell, and then we were very astonished that you guys would go back to a race that you've done before, or a culture you've done before. But now, as you speak of the Telvanni and just how different they are, how alien they are, it makes more sense to us. But I'm curious, what drove you guys to make that decision to do the Telvanni, to do Necrom and Hermaeus Mora?
Absolutely. So like I said before, like it stems from that sort of single nugget of an idea, secrets on secrets on secrets. But I think in a broader context, right? Like if you guys have played the game for a long time, playing through the launch content, the absence of the Telvanni is one of the fun mysteries, right? It's one of the fun, like, in Morrowind, right? In Test 3, they're a pretty noticeable presence, right? Like that quest line and those characters, they really influence the world. And so the fact that they're just not there in either the politics or the framing, either in the launch game or, obviously the Telvanni aren't in the Vardenfell release. And that's a great quest line. But I would make the argument they don't, like, their hand is not heavy on the scale, right? In terms of the main quest on the island. Nope. And so, rolling forward, right? Like, hey, who are we going to talk about? The Telvanni make sense in terms of secrets. Is that enough? Is that enough framing? Well, I think you're going to, I think in the release you'll see, like, there's a lot of there. It all goes back to, like, the chutzpah of saying to literally the rest of the world, hey, I know you guys are, like, doing this little war thing, but we're out. Like, peace, right? Like, I love that. Like, the cojones it takes to, like, say that to the likes of, the Tribunal, Iron, Yorin. Like, that is a beautiful, wonderful sort of emblem of who the Telvanni are. and getting a chance to like, again, like put that on your screen, let you play an experience where you deal with these like massive egos. Like writers and designers love to deal with like egotistical characters because like it's just an excuse to like work out stuff, right? Like it's wonderful, because they can say the quiet part loud. That's what being an egotistical character. Excuse me. That's what being an egotistical character in fiction is all about, right? They get to say the quiet part loud, put it in your face, and just have you deal with it. And that's, I'm not gonna say that's every character in Necrom, because that's not. I don't think that's true. We have a bunch of different variations on how characters come across. Gidane, I mentioned earlier, Prelate Gidane, a great example of a much more sort of low-key dark elf character. But yeah, there's some big personalities on the peninsula, and getting to have you walk among them and see what they're about, I think is wonderful. And then you get to compare and contrast that with Hermaeus Mora, who is perhaps the biggest personality of all, right? Like, man, that guy really, really loves himself, right? It's like, you can tell, right? Dude is a big fan. Hermaeus Mora is the #1 captain of the Hermaeus Mora fan club. That's his job.
It actually segues really well into the next question, which is, how do you use Hermaeus Mora, who is like this enigmatic, creepy, Lovecraftian character that's been around forever, and we still know barely anything about him? How do you balance that with him being, in some ways, the main character of this expansion?
Absolutely. So previously, in Skyrim, and then in sort of the base Elder Scrolls Online experience, he played a very sort of, I mean, enigmatic is the only way to say it, right? Like, he played a role where you did stuff with him, but you kind of didn't know if you were coming or going. You never really understood exactly why you were doing things for him. You could kind of see his motivations in the Dragonborn DLC pretty well, but even then, he very rarely let you like see any of his cards. In this experience, and I obviously, for obvious reasons, I don't want to go too spoilery with it, but like, the stakes are higher for him personally, which is a really interesting place for a Daedric Prince to be in. You know, like, so often the Daedric Princes are manipulating mortals and having them dance to their tune. And in a bunch of releases that Elder Scrolls Online has done, you're either dealing with them directly to punch them in the face, or you're cleaning up after some nonsense that they've strewn across the landscape. Like, we deal with Daedric Princes a lot. This is a chance for Mora to be, you're more of his partner, kind of, than you've ever been, I think, with any Daedric Prince before. Because that's how seriously Mora is taking this situation, right? Like, he would not do what he's doing in the Necrom release if he didn't believe that the stakes were high enough to, like, you know, we're just ugly bags of mostly water, right? Like, you know, Daedric Princes don't want to deal with us on a regular day, and Hermaeus Mora is having not a great day. So the fact that he's willing to put up with us weird mortals tells you how seriously he's taking the situation. So, with all that said, it's a character thing, right? Just like any other character, Mora has motivations. He's got a past. He has secrets, lots of secrets. And so the way that we kind of indexed on saying something new with Mora, not just like repeating the beats that have been done in other releases, is by making his character, like, first and foremost, the lens through which you see him. Like, I think in a lot of other cases, Mora gets used as kind of almost a force of nature, right? Like, especially in like the base ESO quests, he's just there to be like kind of a spooky. They're fun quests, right? But like, he's just there to be like a spooky, like, there's a bunch of tentacles and I'm talking to them. Like, the Mora that you experience in Necrom is a person who has needs, and like, you get the sense is kind of worried. And that's a very interesting place for a Daedric Prince to be.
Would you say this partnership, I suppose, is a closer partnership or working relationship than, say, our relationship with Meridia from the base game?
That's a great question. I will just offer my opinion, which is that I don't think Meridia's motivations in the base game were terribly altruistic.
Okay.
And so our
Mhm.
like engagement with her, right? Like our allyship with her, I think was like we were just a tool of convenience, right?
Mm.
I think you could label that on Mora as well to a certain extent, but I think in terms of like, let me say it very clearly, Mora has skin in the game in Necrom.
Okay.
I won't go into more detail than that. I think if things hadn't turned out the way that Meridia wanted in the base game, she'd have been fine, right? Like at the end of the day, no skin off her nose, right? Like it wouldn't have pleased her if Molag Bal had succeeded in his scheme. It wouldn't have made her happy, but like at the end of the day, she would have been fine, right? This is a different situation for Mora.
Interesting.
So that's how I would sort of compare and contrast these two scenarios.
Okay.
So I usually don't do this, but because of what I've heard from other people, I went ahead and they gave like glowing reviews. So I went ahead and did the whole quest on the PTS. And then aside from the fact that I'm also doing the hard modes on PTS as well, I've spent more time on the PTS than I have on the live servers now. But and I don't want to give away spoilers as well, but you guys made the decision to incorporate some of the lesser utilized princes. I guess that's the best way I can put it. What was the decision like? Because I remember towards the end of the main quest line, Molag Bal talks about the politics of Oblivion and how infinitely complex they are.
Right.
And that's what, when I was playing through that quest, through the Necrom quest line, my mind immediately went to that, and I thought to myself, oh, you guys were probably playing up on that angle that was said, what is it now, like 7 years ago, 8 years ago? More?
Closer to 10.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah.
for the main quest, we're coming up on 10 here. It's going to be great.
So, do you guys do stuff like that where I know we talked about you guys looking at Arena and some older games. Do you guys look at ESO itself and then take parts of it and then look at it and go, hey, you know what? There's a story here. Let's expand it. And was that the case with Necrom?
Absolutely. I hope it comes across that we try to do that the most obvious example of that is like bringing characters back from previous releases, right? That's a nice sort of discrete sort of unit of content to point at. But I think we're always looking for opportunities for like contexts and narrative and lore from previous releases to influence what we're doing in the new thing. I know that it's sort of it's a topic of conversation both inside and outside the building about sort of the conceptual reality of like everything's happening all at once within the year, right? So there's certain ways that we can be referential to events and certain ways we can't. But absolutely, like I love when we have the opportunity to like pluck a nugget out of, especially the base game, because I'm very fond, for obvious reasons, I'm very fond of some of the stuff we did back then, and reframe it here in the new context. In terms of Daedric politics in particular, right? Like, so I, like a lot of people, am a recovering Catholic, and I think just like every writer who has that as sort of a baseline, I always, when I think of, because at the end of the day, right, the Daedra are demons, right? For narrative purposes, there are demons. And as soon as you start talking about like demon politics or the politics between heaven and hell, Aedra and Daedra, pick your poison. You end up talking about high school politics, because man, that's one of my favorite things about like gods and demons and monsters and stuff, is that we as people can't help but write them with the level of like political complexity of like a really nasty infighting high school. So that's the lens that I always use when I think of the Daedric princes, because you get your popular kids, you got your unpopular kids, you got your jocks, you got your geeks, you got your goths, right? Like you can easily put labels on all the Daedric princes and slot them into a fun. I think it'd be actually be a fun like AU, right? There are, for various reasons, a couple of Daedric princes that just have not risen to the level of, again, characters are tools. They haven't been super useful, right, as tools to solve narrative problems. Molag Bal is a great headliner, right? Like when Molag Bal rolls into the story, you know what you're getting, right? Like you know the experience you're going to have. Mehrunes Dagon, Azura, Meridia, or like some of these characters kind of bring the party when they show up. There's a couple of other Daedra Princes that like don't have quite as clearly defined personalities or portfolios, and so yeah, absolutely. Like this was an opportunity. Again, thank you for not being super spoilery, to elevate some of those characters, bring them to the fore, and give them some interesting stuff to do. And we're always looking for opportunities to do that. I love that the Elder Scrolls franchise is set up this way, and I even more so love it because of how the Aedra are set up. Like, you know, they're the weird, distant parents that we're never going to be good enough for, right? And we can have very complex relationships with, because, you know, Stendarr hasn't come back from getting the milk like, you know, 2,000 years ago. It's great. It's great.
I got a real quick tangent question. Have you ever considered doing Aedric stuff? You know, like it's like one of those holes kind of in the greater Elder Scrolls mythos. Like we don't know a ton about them, and they very rarely influence the physical world because it takes a lot of energy for them to do so. But have you ever considered, you know, throwing in an Aedric plot?
I would say, like, just super truthfully, we've never. If you guys have had a conversation, chances are we've probably had something similar in-house too, about a potential story opportunity. I will say, you know, putting on my fun please hat for a moment, that is the kind of thing that if I were to be in a conversation about, I would try to sort of heavily disincentivize us from moving in that direction. And the reason for that is the Aedra and their role in Tamriel is one of the things that really sets the Elder Scrolls apart from other franchises, right? I love Dungeons & Dragons, I love Faerun, right? But the gods of Faerun are very active participants in a variety of fashions, right? With the events in that setting. The Aedra as remote parents, as the, you know, Stendarr who hasn't come back from milk, like that says a lot about what reality is, I think, to me. And maintaining that as like one of the sort of defining characteristics of the Elder Scrolls IP is one of the things I think that I would sort of be inclined to put as, you know, there's no hard and fast rules, right? Like at the end of except maybe talking about where the Dwemer went, but like,
like there's some rules, you know, don't talk about the Dwemer, don't talk about Akavir, don't talk too much about Aedra.
Well, and you know, but even the things you just described, and I said that jokingly, right? We've done that in the game, right? We have lots of characters in the game who have opinions about where the Dwemer went, or, you know, about what the deal with the Aedra are. But I'd rather, again, that, you know, unreliable narration, right? I'd rather keep it in that sphere and provide a lot of fodder for great conversations about it, than have, like, you know, hey guys, it's Akatosh. How's it going? Whoa, things are messed up around here. Let's fix this. Like, you know, immediately, right? I think that's less interesting, right? Because that removes a ton of ambiguity. Now, this is a specific character, right? This is a specific person and a personality and a voice actor, and like, in a way. Actually, let's go back to the Dwemer, because I think that's an even easier thing.
Okay.
Any answer that we or Bethesda give to you guys as players for where the Dwemer went will be way less interesting than anything you've got in your head. Like, I'm just going to tell you right now, it's such a great mystery now, right? There's no answer we could give you that would live up to expectations. So I would rather just not do it, right?
I agree.
I would just rather sidestep that as a conversation point. And I feel kind of the same way about the Aedra, right? Like, if Stendarr were to roll up, he would not meet your expectations. He wouldn't meet my expectations, honestly. To be really frank. So, like, that's why I'd like to keep them in that beautiful box in the sky.
It's interesting that you say that, because you guys have actually done a really, really good job painting the Aedra as grayish characters. They're not, you know, always the good guys.
Right.
I think one of my favorite things, it's a very small thing, but when you do the Southern Elsewhere questline, and you speak to Jadari, she flat out says Alkosh is tired of mortals. She said, I believe the line is, Alkosh watches mortals with a weary eye. And then she also says that Alkosh will not help you unless one of his blood helps you. And I believe Nafalar is the character in that sense. So, like, he's not motivated by altruism at all. Which is funny, because, you know, he's one of the biggest he has one of the biggest bases of worship within Tamriel as a whole. And then you have these pseudo Adric characters in the form of the Celestials. Obviously, one of them extremely corrupt, going back to the Void Ghost, and just these little things that you have, and I really appreciate them a lot.
Well, and again, it's all point of view, right? Like that's why the monomyth is such a great sort of like construct that we can move around the board and we can use as a framework for a lot of different stories, right? Like everybody sees Akatosh, excuse me, culturally everybody sees Akatosh in a different way, and so you look at say Oriel, right? And Oriel has a bunch of baggage to them that, you know, the way the Nords look at them and the way that the Imperials look at them, like it's all through a lens darkly, right? And so that's one of the things I really love about the setting is that the Aedra, and again, why I don't think the Aedra should ever like show up on screen is like I think it's much more interesting for everybody to have their viewpoints and opinions.
Well, these sort of have shown up like a little bit in Morrowind, you know, when they have their...
You're talking about the end of Oblivion.
Or, well, yeah, the end of Oblivion, but also in Morrowind, there's like these avatars guy. Like, one of them is heavily implied to be Talos, one I believe is Stabella, one I believe is Stendar. It's been a while. Yeah. Actually, yeah, it is Morrowind. But, you know, like, they don't come down, but their influence, like, their fingers are still in the Mundus. Right. But they're not present.
Yeah, as opposed to Skyrim, where like you actually meet Sun and you have to fight him in order to get across the bridge.
Right, and again, it's a great way to compare and contrast them with the Daedra, right? Because Sheogorath will show up for your birthday party, right? Like you just have to ask nice.
And Oreo will send you $20, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. Sort of getting away from... Sorry, what?
Oh, I was going to say that the Aedra are like concepts, the Daedra are like personalities.
Right. That's what I've heard. I've always took Aedra as like, from what little I know of lore, like kind of like sentient forces of nature, maybe like the wind. Sometimes they care,
basically,
sometimes it doesn't.
That's what they are.
Yeah. But kind of getting away from the Aedra and Daedra thing. You mentioned about the Telvanni, how they're egotistical. How do you? What was the inspiration behind your narrative framing around the Telvanni? Like, are they just, you know, egotistical maniacs and powerful wizards, or is there like more inspirations behind that?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, just like with Mora, we talked a little bit about like getting to put a new frame around him. He's got skin in the game. It's a new chance for us to characterize him in a bit of a different sense. Putting the Telvanni front and center as main characters of this narrative lets us show the sort of the length and breadth of what does it mean to be a powerful sorcerer within that house, right? So you got Meln the Mouthless, who is again, I want to avoid spoilers, but he is a very sort of specific viewpoint on a Telvanni Magister. He is more, for a variety of reasons, he's a little bit more accessible, I think, than your average Magister. So the player is able to spend quite a bit of time talking with them. So Meln is going to be a great sort of like on-ramp character into the mind of a Magister, into what it takes to be viable within the house. We have a number of other characters who are within the house who interact like politically. You get to do a little house politics. I apologize for the coughing.
You're fine.
The trees here in Maryland are
blooming.
You know, just vigorously engaging with each other, and so I
understand completely.
Yeah, so I suffer a little bit as a result. Yeah, it's a great chance for us to sort of crack this, because the Telvanni, other than what you see in Elder Scrolls 3, and because of time and distance, their sort of setting and their relationship to the culture then is different than it is here and now. But the core of what it means to be a Magister, the core of what the house like is still pretty inscrutable. And so this was an opportunity for us to like crack that open and demystify them a little bit. There's still plenty of mystery. Like we don't let all the cats out of the bag, but spending as much time as you do with Magisters and, you know, representatives of the house, in this, as you do in this release, I think will give people a lot of chance to like understand much more directly what the group is about, what they care about, and again, what it takes to stand up to the rest of the world and say like, nah, we're neutral. You guys have your war.
Okay.
Having played the quest on PTS, when I was interacting with the Telvanni characters and I was looking at the sociology of the characters and the politics within House Telvanni, I was vaguely reminded of Star Wars in terms of the Sith Lords and the almost sociopathic culture that's promoted within it. And I was wondering, like, do you guys like draw sources, like inspiration from these different sources and stuff like that when you're writing these larger than life characters that are so self-obsessed with each other?
That's a great touch point. I believe that did come up. I know one that Tom and I talked about specifically was, you look at the different sort of magical groups out in the world, right? The Mages Guild is like the IBM of magic, right? Like safe, kind of boring, but like has really good best practices, right? They've been doing this for a long time, right? And then there's a bunch of other groups. The Telvanni are, in my view, Silicon Valley startup culture, right? Big personalities.
With all the pitfalls that entails.
Right, exactly. Like the upside is very up, right? You get some incredible magics. You get some beautiful, like the Vard. I tried to like bring this in actually in the Loremasters archive with Divith. The Vardvark is a product, right? Like you had a guy in his garage who made this cute little thing, and when the Telvanni Council got wind of this marketable item, even though he wasn't super engaged with it, they were like, guess what you're doing now? Here we go. We're going to market this. It's going to be wonderful, right? Exactly that mentality, right? So big upside, potentially like huge, tremendous, like Nern-shaping magics. But man, there's like a lot of big personalities. There's a lot of like, I would say that the Telvanni are not, generally speaking, maybe like the most socially well-adjusted people, like as a group, right? So you get a lot of that. You get a lot of like those different factions and micro factions, and you're my friend today, but by Thursday we're enemies again. Like that kind of a vibe. I think all of us have engaged with sort of the popular culture around Silicon Valley. I have some friends who've worked in a bunch of tech companies, so I've heard stories firsthand. That's, I think, sort of some of the influence in the framework we had around Telvanni, what it means to be Telvanni Magister.
I'm getting like cutthroat but smart vibes.
Right.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Tons of intelligence. Sometimes not the wisest people.
Right.
Divith Fear cloned himself several times to... I'm not even going to get into that, but like he did an amazing thing for a stupid reason.
Right.
Okay.
I'm also pretty sure he hasn't done that yet. Thank goodness.
Yeah, that's later.
Yeah. Because that's a choice.
All right. We could get into it. I'm just kidding. But I actually have this really burning question I've always wanted to ask a Loremaster, which now happens to be you. It's always kind of bothered me ever since I found out as a ESO player about it. So
Can I tell you about this?
No, I told you about this after I found out about this, and you didn't believe me, and then you looked it up.
Well, I've known about it.
Yeah, since I told you. But anyway.
I don't... Whatever.
Okay, so my burning question is, about ESO, or the lore and the stories of ESO that we get to experience as players. Apparently, it all takes place within 1 year. Like the second era, year 582. So everything from Orsinium to Necrom, the vestige is somehow doing all these adventures, saving the world 10 times in 1 year. Is there a reason for this? Is there a consideration for maybe changing this in the future? Because I'm not just the only person that has a problem with it. Because there's a lot of players who are like, once they find out, they're like, well, this doesn't make sense. Kills my immersion.
I want to add really quick, it wasn't always like that. Like when Morrowind came out, the first release had a jump forward in time, but they were later removed.
I thought that was with Orsinium. 1 year.
It was with Orsinium. Orsinium was originally in second era 583, and then in Morrowind it was changed back to 582.
There's definitely a letter in Morrowind that was dated as a year that is not the base game year that was later removed.
Okay, well, regardless, is there any, I guess, like discussion on your end about that?
So, I will frame this in a very specific way.
Mhm.
So, like I said, I think early in this conversation, my sort of primary role is to be a resource for this stuff. You're not wrong. You know, I won't disagree with you. Canonically, everything is happening in 1 year.
Mhm.
The way that I sort of discussed, because I think when I talked to Imperial Library, we talked about this a little bit as well. And the way that I'll frame my response to this is, being a professional creative is sometimes about constraints, right?
Mhm.
Like in a very real way, constraints breed creativity. If we could do literally anything, I actually think it would be detrimental to the product that we make because we're operating within a specific environment, because we're operating within like the needs to, you know, we're not just trying to entertain you guys, right? We're trying to make
Right.
sure that you guys are engaged enough with what we're making that you're like, hey, we'll slip you a little coin, right? All that said, the framework as it exists is meant to, I think, support the franchise as a whole, right?
Hmm.
We could very easily, let's just take the number of releases we've done so far. If we space those out 1 year at a time, you guys are familiar with the timeline of Tamriel, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some pretty important stuff coming up, like from a historical perspective, like just around the corner. And so, like, we want to be supportive to everybody that's working on an Elder Scrolls product, right?
Hmm.
We don't want to dominate the conversation completely. And so I think that's one of the things that feeds into this framework. Now, again, I want to frame this is just me talking.
Mhm.
I don't represent anything beyond that. I understand that people find it sometimes frustrating. I totally hear that, and I don't want to downplay that at all. I completely understand why it's frustrating. The best way I could frame it is by going back to that original thing that we talked about when we talked about unreliable narration, right? The one true canonicity, the one true canon that you have as an Elder Scrolls character is what you experience. So for me, I'm one of those folks, probably not surprising, who like has played through everything in order as they've been released, right? So for my character's canonicity, like I started on Canarthes because of course I'm an Aldmeri Dominion player. Hello. I started in Canarthes Roost, and I played through to the end of Reaper's March. I went off and I saved Tamriel and Cold Harbor, and I've done each release in sequence as we've gone along. And so that's the canon of my character. And at the end of the day, I think that's the most important timeline, personally, right? That's the timeline that we want to be respectful for. It's one of the reasons, like, our tools are great, but it does take effort to do things like, hey, I recognize that you did the Elsewhere chapter, right? That does take some effort on our part to make sure that happens, but it's worth it, right? Because I love it when you talk to Irene on High Isle, and I've done everything, right? And I got to ask her questions about all the adventures we had together back in the Aldmeri Dominion. Like, to me, that's deeply, as a player, that's deeply satisfying. So that's how I like personally frame it, right? It's like, what's the personal canon of your character? How does that map to your gameplay experience? And is that satisfying? Do we make sure that we recognize your character's experience as much as possible within the game? That's where it lands on my head.
Right, that makes sense with the constraint you need for the timeline. But out of curiosity, I don't know much about lore. What comes after the Three Banners War?
Our Septum's coming up.
Yeah, within the next 300 years, the Tiber War starts and the foundations of the Third Empire.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot
There's
of
a couple other
chapters.
things.
Yeah.
I will say,
Who's Cyberceptum? I mean, is he even important? Whatever.
Sorry, what were you saying?
yeah,
Felix?
no, I was saying I fully appreciate the fact that you have to make compromises. 'Cause
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not easy. Like you guys, when you have the team of several hundred people working on one thing, it's a live service that's constantly being updated with millions of lines of code. Like I can imagine it gets very hectic. But it is definitely one of the things that we see in ESOU, particularly from new players, is that they start the game up, and the most frequent question we get is, "Where do I go next?"
Right. No, and I want to make super clear, as much as I can, and I really mean this from the bottom of my heart. We absolutely hear this as feedback, and I would strongly invite, obviously in a hopefully in an uplifting fashion, in a constructive, creative fashion. Please definitely give this kind of feedback, right? Because I think it's super helpful. Everybody comes at the game from a different point of view, right? Like some people live and die on the battles in Cyrodiil, and and their experience is just as valid and just as interesting to me as like folks like you all who are like reading every book, like engaging with every character, right? And it's a big gamut of experiences that go into being a player of Elder Scrolls Online. So if you ever find yourself being like, it's frustrating to me, right, that I don't have a resource to look at the timeline, or I think it's weird that everything's happening in 1 year, definitely give that feedback, because I think that's super valid. I don't ever want you and the folks watching to get the impression that we don't care about that, because we absolutely do. I promise you we do. And we hear it.
So I want to ask something. It's a little bit higher level. It might be a little touchy, but I'll start by saying Final Fantasy XIV is another MMO. You know, it's a competitor to ESO, to be frank, just by virtue of being the same genre. And the story is very much linear, and you have to play it in order. And, you know, you see these characters grow, and, like, they go on adventures with you, they live, they die. Do you think that could work for ESO? Like, a mandatory linear timeline with like reoccurring characters? Like, I'm not saying to make the current game into that, but do you think it could work for it?
So I love Final Fantasy XIV. I think it's an awesome game. I played it a whole bunch. I love the way they tell stories. No. Fundamentally, they do not tell stories the way that Elder Scrolls tell stories. So in my head, we have the same problem space as Bethesda does when they do numbered releases. Ours is just the scale, right? It's just a sense. It's just a problem of scale. So in Skyrim, right, they have to write and design the game such that you can go do any quest line in any order and they can't stomp on each other, right? Like, you need to be able, if you want to walk out the front door at Helgen, make a left and go do the Dark Brotherhood first and not care about, literally not even care about the dragons, right? Like, the dragon attacks aren't even happening. They have to support that, right? They have to allow you to do that. We have the same essential problem, except scaled up dramatically, right? Across many different releases, across many years now, almost a decade of making the game, right? So I love that as a framework. And I think that the original question you were asking about, like everything happening in 1 year, I completely understand where that's a concern and why that strains credulity. But I think those are two very different questions, right? Do I think the Elder Scrolls Online should be a linear story, you know, that starts... I mentioned how we wrote the base game, right? I even now today go, if we knew then what the product is going to be now, we never would have done that, right? Because at the time we were writing for 1 to was it 50? 1 to 50. Sorry, it's been so long I don't even remember. 1 to 50 scaling MMO experience that by definition was linear, right? Because you literally, like, if you wanted to go walk off to another zone and you were level 32, you couldn't, because you get stomped, right? Like that was how the game was designed. But now, right, with One Tamriel and the true freedom of an actual Elder Scrolls experience, which I love, and I think people, it's one of the reasons people play the game, right? I genuinely don't think it'd be a good idea to make it truly linear and say, like, hey, the Vardenfell release, the Morrowind release, canonically happens like before High Isle or before Blackwood.
Right.
I don't think that's a good idea. Now, again, what I do love is the way that I mentioned before your personal canon, right? Like for me, the Morrowind release happened before Blackwood because that's how I played them. So when you go to Blackwood, right? And I don't remember if we did this offhand in Blackwood because I wasn't here for it. But if we did ever reference something from Morrowind in Blackwood, like because I'd played them in that order, we would reference it. We would call that out, and then I would be like, I remember that thing from. Sorry, better reference. I definitely played the Dark Brotherhood before I did Blackwood. So like as a member of the Dark Brotherhood, right? That came up in the main story of the Blackwood chapter, right? And that was extremely gratifying to me, like because I love that. I love the DBH. I love the Thieves Guild content, and so that's the kind of linear narrative I think that I think is an Elder Scrolls function. I separate that from the everything happens in 1 year conversation. I think those are two separate things.
I would 100% definitely agree. I think Final Fantasy XIV has a definiteness to its story that is inherently just clashes with Elder Scrolls in general.
Right.
Because Elder Scrolls is just, it's very turbulent, but
Still
it
great.
flows.
Final Fantasy XIV is an awesome product. It's just
I'm not dogging on it.
It's just
100%
very
not
Two
dogging
different ways to tell a story.
But
Right, exactly.
It's a completely different style of narrative.
Yeah.
One of the things, though, was that in regards to the story and the way you guys continuously write stories, you guys must have to continuously keep a pulse, like a hand on the pulse of what's being written as you write more and more stuff, because the game's growing by the year. It's like phenomenal amounts of literature has been written about it. Do you guys have this your own internal system of keeping track of everything as you create more? I know, or do you, there's this vague rumor, and again, it's just rumor, that sometimes you guys have to go to the USP or the Imperial Library to keep check on some stuff.
I mean, I would frame it as whether it's Discord, whether it's Discords or Reddit or Twitter or Facebook or websites. Like, if people are talking about Elder Scrolls, if they're expressing viewpoints about the franchise, on some level we are definitely, and I hope this isn't creepy, we're listening, right? Like we're engaging in that conversation, because to us, Tamriel is this living, breathing space. Like we talked before about sort of that sense of being a person on the ground, getting to sort of feel what it's like to live on Nirn, right? And in order to make that feel real, in order to make it feel engaging, I think it requires us to listen to what you guys have to say. It requires us to engage with, commentary on UESP pages, or Twitter threads, or whatever. Pick your poison, right? This is, all the developers that work on Elder Scrolls Online are incredibly engaged with this as a product, but none of us would be doing it if you guys didn't show up and play, right? So at the end of the day, we're all just extremely eager to make sure that the world we're creating, the narratives we're crafting, are, to use the British term, fit for purchase, right? You guys, when you walk into a chapter, we want you to expect great things from it, to expect great things from us, and to be able to deliver on them. So yeah, absolutely. Anywhere that there's Elder Scrolls nuggets to be seen and engaged with, we're there.
This might be another little bit of a touchy question, but it's related to the fan communities thing. The Elder Scrolls has had a very, very long history with fan works, and there is a little bit of controversy with some certain fan works, of course, Coda. And one of the biggest ones is stuff like the Utak mythos, if you've ever heard of it, of the Bat Elves. Do you guys ever take inspiration from fan works? Do you ever look for ways to incorporate them pay homage to them, or anything? Like, is that in your radar, in your sphere?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer really directly, no. And the reason for that is, I don't ever want someone to feel like we have stolen from them, right? Like, I think probably everybody on the call is aware of there was a really unfortunate miscommunication with a product on the in-game store recently, and that experience is exactly why the answer to that question is no, because like I just said, we absolutely listen when people talk about the game, right? Like, I love this, I hated this character was great, like, bring this dude back, right? That's the kind of stuff that we want to engage with. We desperately want you guys to create stuff. We want you guys to create fan art and fan fiction and write, endless lore screeds and do 7-hour lore breakdowns. Like, I love that stuff. But a lot of the time, I might notice it and, like, register that it's a thing, but it is very rare that I would, like, sort of click in and engage in detail, because I never want to be in a situation where I'm, because we're all human beings just like anybody else, right? Like, again, I don't want to reference the thing that happened earlier, but, like, people make mistakes, and I, as a human being, right, if I engage in a giant lore thread where people are throwing ideas against the wall, and then I'm in a conversation with my boss down the line, and some part of my weird chemical soup that keeps me sentient, like, clicks back to that thing from some lore thread, and I regurgitate it as my own idea, that's not great, right? That's not a situation I ever want to be in. None of us want to be in. That's not a situation as a developer you ever want to be in. So please keep doing it. Please keep engaging. I love how creative the Elder Scrolls, the ESO fam is. But generally speaking, like, that's the kind of thing that we try not to dig too deeply into for exactly that reason.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, and it's very respectful, and I appreciate your answer and your candor, actually. But would you say, completely hypothetical, someone who wrote a fan piece is hired at ZOS 10 years down the line, and they're on the writing team, and they go back to their own, like, fan and piece, like, would that be permitted? Would that be, a way to get their work into the larger mythos? Are they, like, prohibited from doing that?
I'm not going to say that there would be, like, a hard. I think the likelihood of that happening is so unlikely. I don't think that we'd ever make, like, a hard rule about that. But I will say, like, as I think I and many other people who make games have said ad infinitum, making games is a deeply collaborative work. Like, I think it would be frankly really hard to do that, like, draw a straight line from I wrote this fan idea and now it's in the video game. Like, I think it would be very challenging for any individual to do that, because if nothing else, my dumb butt is in the way of that happening, right? And the head of content, the lead writer, the writer who works with the designer, the designer, like, all down the line, we're all talking to each other and engaging in creative ideas. And, like, in this sort of theoretical situation you're talking about, I would imagine they'd be very protective of this fan idea, right? Like, that kind of thing would throw up flags very quickly in the collaborative environment that we work in. And I think it would be very hard for that to actually, like, fully make its way into the video game. Because that's just kind of not how it's one of the great parts of working at ZOS is I don't work with jerks. I don't work with don't work with Telvanni Magisters, right? Like, people are extremely collaborative. They're very thoughtful, and it's a genuinely, like, uplifting place to work, because at a base level, I think we all respect each other, and so that is I find it relatively unlikely that kind of thing, that kind of person who had, like, an agenda would get in the door in the first place. Thank goodness. And then if they did, it would be very challenging for that thing to sort of find its way all the way through.
It's Audens' plan, the 10-year plan.
Well, no, it's just a
No, I'm just
hypothetical,
kidding.
and like, I assume that some people on the writing staff would have like stuff that they're passionate about. Like I know, your predecessor Lemon Tuttle said a few times that he loves like Alessia's stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I mean,
So
yeah.
like people like throw out stuff they want to see, and then like pass it down the line. Like, hey, could we maybe get this in? I'm really passionate about it. I love writing about it.
Right. I mean, I've talked. I think I'm saying this wrong. Piandonia. How is it? Piandonia? What's the
I
right?
don't remember.
Yeah. Anyway, like
Condonia.
I find that like that concept in the lore, that the realm of the sea elves, right? Like I find that fascinating. I think it's a really interesting cultural thing. I've mentioned it a couple times before. But like that, everybody being human and like enjoying parts of the lore, I think is a plus, not a minus, right? Like Lehman really liked Alessia, and so it was like a fun lens for him to look at the content in the game and to find opportunities to speak to it in sort of a truthful way. The characterization that I wasn't even involved with it, but like the characterization of Captain Saraven recently in the Galen release, like I love how that opened the door for sea elves and brought them into sort of a new context within the game, because I think that culture is super fascinating. But like, yeah, I think that's just the truth of it is, again, we're humans, right? We're all just people. And so we all have stuff we like and stuff we don't. And personal preferences end up influencing us just like any sort of creative outlet. But I think it's more like that, right? Where it's like, I just happen to like stuff and happen not to. I don't think any of us have agendas per se.
I think it's super
Great answer.
cool you're describing this collaborative environment, because I think most people, when they think of Loremaster or writers, they don't think of it as that intensely collaborative environment where everyone has to kind of pass each other on everything, which is I think that probably people have misconceptions about writing for a game or even writing for a screen, right?
Oh yeah.
So
No, I mean, to be a writer in the games industry, you absolutely need to be able to string sentences together into coherent fashion.
Yeah.
1000%. But it is first and foremost a communication role.
Yep.
Like you are an advocate for narrative. You are talking to other people. You're running down problems. You're problem solving. You're often writing documentation, much more so. Obviously, we talked earlier about dialogue writing. Dialogue writing is like it's the thing we spend the most time on and iteration on, because let's face it, it's expensive, right? Getting voice actors into the booth is an expensive proposition. And it's our primary channel through which we tell narrative in the game, right? But the role of being a writer in the game industry is first and foremost about like bringing together this huge nexus of different disciplines to create that narrative. A lot of companies use the term narrative designer to describe this work, and I think writer, and this is a long separate conversation, but I think writer and narrative designer are two different like fields of study, fields of influence within a company. But at their heart, the thing that they share, right, is they're working together collaboratively with a bunch of different people to like make the story happen in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm just that, except like everybody in the company, depending on the week, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
That's really cool.
About a year ago, we had Mike Finnegan on the podcast,
Yep.
and he said that ZOS works almost 2 years in advance on new releases and expansions. I would imagine, like, with how complex the narratives of your expansions are and how nuanced they are, how many layers they have, working on multiple expansions at once, again, 2 years in advance. Like, you're currently working on Necrom, making sure it's polished, because the release date is just in a few weeks, like just a few days away now.
Right.
And then if you're also working on the next expansion, and then another one 2 years from now, that can get immensely overwhelming. So how do you guys manage that?
Thankfully, the number of people that have to keep sort of multiple full releases in their head is kind of a small group. The bulk of the team, descends like locusts on a specific release, and we do our many iterative cycles, developing the product, making it great, making sure it's in a good place, and then the swarm moves on to the next thing. And then, like at this point, right, Necrom, I think Tom Murphy primarily is like probably the last man standing in terms of making sure that the game that we play on launch day is going to be like that really incredible moment, because by now, just before ship, like something like 99% of all the tracked I'm not going to say the bugs, but all the tracked bugs are resolved, right, one way or the other. The dialogue's long since been processed. The audio team's done their work. The music's in. Like, everything's squared away. And the bulk of the team has now moved on to the next thing. The group of people that has to care about the thing after the next thing is thankfully a very small group. And yeah, so it can be somewhat challenging, but thankfully, just like any other creative process, right? We do have a process. We've been doing this for a long time now, and I'm very lucky to work with guys like Jeremy and Rich and Bill, because they've done this a whole bunch. So when my part of that conversation comes up, they're very directed about sort of what they're looking for from me and how I can support them in their role. Because again, I'm the bard, right? I'm over here in the corner singing like, "Let me tell you a tale of how the Dark Elves would care about their ancestors. Let's jam, shall we?" Right? Like, that's my job.
Yeah. I just
voice acting.
Yeah, you good voice for it.
I just imagine a room full of post-it notes whenever when Ce-Nex asked that question of how do you guys keep track of everything. Yeah, I just got to meet Jeremy in San Francisco earlier this year. He described some of the process, and I was like, man, this sounds really complicated with so many teams working like all at the same time on one thing and then the next. It's pretty cool.
So, with your permission, we have now several lore questions from the community that they would like, if possible. If you can answer, obviously, you're under restrictions and limitations.
Right, so a couple of things. First, if it's cool with you, can we time box it to about 15 minutes, if that's all right?
Sure,
and,
sure.
You know, if you want to go a little further, I'd love to cap her out about 2 hours. As you can tell, I do have a little bit of allergies, and we've been
of course.
It's been an hour and 40.
Thank you, that'd be great. And then the other thing, and I will just state this as a front thing up front. I want to be really clear. One of the reasons I really like the Loremasters Archive format is it lets me do some of this stuff inside that unreliable narration framework that we talked about, right?
Within the character, yeah.
Exactly, right? Like if Divith or my buddy Xander, if they make statements that in some, like, actually it was great because I think Xander said more inflammatory things than Divith did, which is great. If Xander says something ridiculous, right? It's not me saying it. It's Xander. Right. So I want to preface all of this with, I am happy to give you guys some high level viewpoints of me, Michael Zenke the dude, but like I'm very hesitant to be like, and here's my wizard hat, and now here's the unvarnished, the true truth of the Elder Scrolls friend, because I'm just like, that's just not the job, right? Like that's not what I do inside the building, and I don't want to present that as what I do for you guys either. So I would love to talk about some specific lore stuff, but let's keep it in that framework if that's okay. Like we're having a conversation.
But we do not expect definite answers.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So the first question is, way back in the base game, in Cold Harbor, there's a lore book in the Library of Dusk. And within that lore book, it lists a bunch of other lore books that are kept within the library.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Some of them are just mind-blowing. Apparently, Mola Ball at one point had the blueprints to the Numidium. And then there are letters of correspondence between Alessia and Belharza, an apocryphal account of Pelennor Whitestrake conversing with the Heart of Lorcan. Is there any chance we will ever see some of these books in game?
That's a great question, and I will answer it exactly the same way that we talked about, like the Aedra showing up in the game, right? I think any book that we wrote, right, for some of those books would not do any justice to what you folks have in your head about what the content of that book would be. Now, I think partially, yes, we could do some. In fact, I very specifically, because I think this was a topic of conversation a while back with the Imperial Library folks, and I had this in my head as I was doing some writing for the Zone flavor text in the Necrom release. And so, like, for example, Apocrypha's quote, it's blurb is from Morian Zenas out of his book that we will never write the full scope of. That's an example of where I think excerpts from those books or like little nuggets from those books might find their way out into the book. Because I agree with you, they're like super fascinating like texts to reference, right? But I wouldn't think we would ever go out of our way to like, we're going to write out the whole of Morian Zenas' treatise, right? And put it out in the world. Because I just don't think it would be, I just don't think it would be as fun as like what we all have in our heads of what that could be.
So
Please do that. That would be awesome.
Possibility of fragments that we'll get, not the
That'd
entire.
be very cool.
Sorry, what?
No, go ahead.
In Vegas, is it true that you were responsible for the naming of the food dishes and the drinks? Because I heard that when we were in Vegas, I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. But I wanted to ask you. I didn't get to ask you in Vegas if that's true.
This is an example of one of the weird things that I do for my job. Sometimes the marketing folks are like, hey, we got these like food things. Can you theme? I did have lore blurbs for everyone too.
Yeah.
I was bummed that like the little cards weren't big enough to put the little lore blurb. Because I mean, that's, you know, as a writer, I'm always wanting to cram more text into a place, right? But yeah, no, that was a fun exercise.
I literally have the Elder Scrolls cookbook right here, so let's we'll test you on some of them.
I love that thing.
Well,
Yeah.
these were drinks and foods. I believe he named not from the cookbook. It's just
Yeah,
like Arcanist Domain. That was a better drink than the White Gold, in my opinion. I don't think I'm.
Arcanist Domain was great.
Yeah, I love the Arcanist Domain.
One of the fun parts, actually. Let me, if I could take this in a slightly serious direction for a second.
Sure.
Actually, the White Gold Fashioned was the name of the old fashioned there, and that's a great example of. I actually was when I was looking at the drinks, I was like, I need good names for these, so I threw it out to the writers as a whole, like collaborating with the writing group and picking their brains and finding interesting like avenues is one of my favorite things, because we have a tremendously talented group of writers who works on ESO, and like again, I'm just one guy, and so like finding different avenues to look into the lore. We do this all the time about much more serious things than what to name a drink at a fan event, but like that's an example of one where I was like, hey guys, I don't have a good name for the old fashioned, like what, help me out here. And I believe it was Julie who pulled that one out. I never would have come up with the White Gold Tower. That is not a thing that I would have pulled out of my head, and I just freaking love that. So.
Do you do the fish as well? Because I feel the fish are quite like lore as well, kind of.
Yeah, I did all the rest of them because it's freaking
amazing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go on, please.
So the next question is actually from me, and it is a question I've been asking since I think 2019. I've been trying to find the answer to this question. Nafalar calls Jadari Tosh Raka. That's the title he uses for her in the dragon language. And I've been wondering for the longest time, the word Tosh in dragon, is it the same definition as in we see that Lawrence Schick gave for Nidic and Altmeri, as in it means dragon or time within the context?
I'm just reading a little bit about what you're talking about here. So from context, that sounds like a good interpretation to me, right? I would very much say this is a great example of where, like, I think the way that characters interact with each other and the life that they breathe between them, right? Like, what I just heard you say tracks for me, I think, with the intent behind the line, but I am hesitant to be like, and that's the objective truth of like Tamriel, of this experience within the experience of the quest, right? Like, I think the relationship between those two characters, you don't need one word to sort of suss out what the relationship was like, if that makes sense as an answer.
Yeah, because the dialogue between us lore nerds is generally means Toshraka. Some like translates into dragon friend or dragon ally. The Raka part has been very conjecture on our part, but for Tosh is what we have through the etymologies. You guys have established. That's what we figured out, at the very least. Let's see. This next question is actually.
Oh,
Can I ask?
go ahead.
All right. So in the Divith Fear Loremasters archive, there is a very small mention of a city that has not been seen since Arena, Firewatch. And I believe Divith says outsiders should not go to Firewatch. Is there a reason for that? Does it suck there?
In context there, he was being threatening. He was like, don't come sniffing around if you don't want to deal with, like, one of the things, I just mentioned earlier, right? Like, the view we sort of had was the Telvanni house as Silicon Valley startup culture. Well, in that ecology, right, if you imagine sort of a Tech Valley startup, right, Divith is even worse than any of those other chuckleheads because he's a consultant. And consultants, they get paid through the nose. They can do and say anything. They're the worst. So that's why I love the idea of Divith being the front man to talk for the house, is because if he said anything crazy, right, the capital C council, the council proper, could just say like, Divith doesn't actually, he like works for us, he works with us, but he's like not actually of us, right? So like they could parse blame out to him. So that was what was in my head when I was like, who should we have right for that Loremasters archive? So yeah, I love Divith. He's a great character.
I love him too. And the fact that he's so old too, like he's been around since Nerevar's age.
Right.
So this next question is from Reddit, TS Lore. Will we see, because we've already been to Adamantia in the very beginning, you guys added that starter quest zone.
Oh yeah.
Will we visit Adamantia once again? Will it be portrayed within the story? And will we finally get to see the Argent Aperture that's mentioned in the lore book once? The 13 locking rings that are next to the Zero Stone.
Great question. So, to make sure I'm understanding the first part of the question, you're talking about the starter experience where you go through the different portals?
Yes, Adamantia the Tower.
Right. Yeah, the Adamantia Tower. So you're asking, like, would we ever use that in a different context or like a different piece of content other than the starting piece?
Yeah. That's the...
I mean, I'm never going to say we're never going to do something. That starter is really good, right? And it fits really well with our like ever expanding like framework of options when you first start a character. So like if doing new content there would require like deprecating or removing that as a starting experience, I'm gonna say probably not. But again, I don't know the future on this axis. I don't know the future any more better or worse than you do. It's like maybe. I certainly don't think that's any, if there was a good reason to use the tower as a setting for a piece of content, I don't think that there's any particular reason why we wouldn't. But I again, like that starter experience is awesome, and so I can't imagine us taking that out of the game. Yeah. Don't quote me on that. This is just like me thinking out loud, right?
Yeah.
Because of that, then I would guess probably no. Like, I don't think anytime soon we're going to see the Argent Aperture like show up as the focus of a piece of content, if that makes sense.
All right.
We have
let's see. This next question also from... I'm sorry.
No, we have about 5 minutes left.
I have a super quick question.
Oh, okay.
From Reddit.
Okay.
Is Mirak around? Yes or no?
Sorry, go ahead.
So, like, is he? Did you consider him at all? Like when writing Apocrypha for Necrom?
Mirak?
Yeah, Mirak.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Mirak.
From Dragonborn?
Okay.
Mirak.
Yeah. I would say that's okay. Look who you're talking to. Like, I was like, Mirak, who's he talking to? Oh, that guy. Okay, great. I'm not going to give any details, but it is possible there is content in the game that references him in some way.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
That's cool.
I have a couple questions from audience members. These should be quick questions. So, and this is actually, before I ask the first question, I have a tangent because I think in San Francisco and Vegas, when I was talking to the devs, it came up a lot, the fact that the tooltips for the Arcanist skills, that this was a very heavy collaborative area between the writers and the lore team and the combat developers for tooltips. And this question kind of pertains to that. In the scale Arcanist domain, there are terms mentioned: the Vigoratum of Hermaeus Mora, the Enigmatum of Morian Zenas, and the Leviathanum of the Abyssal Sea. Tongue twisters here.
Leviathanum.
Yep. What are those terms, and how do they relate to the Arcanist arcane spell forms? Are they just books?
So when I was working with the combat team on the Arcanist tooltips, one of the things that I love is the opportunity to put lore and context and narrative in sort of unexpected places. Our tooltips for the class, right, are a great opportunity to speak to internally, right, what Arcanists think about themselves, what they care about, and what they value, right? In the recent Loremasters archive, Xander speaks a little bit to, there's a throwaway reference in the tooltips to Rune Knights, and he expands on that as well. So this is a place where I will say I don't want to be spoilery, but all of the references called out in the Arcanist tooltips are sort of like real, whether or not they're well explored in this release or maybe in a future release. There's content and ideas behind all of them. The Arcanist was a great experience. I wrote like a jillion things that have absolutely nothing to do with what we actually shipped. And so like a lot of those ideas are still in my head or in a doc, and the tooltips and that kind of framing was a great chance to like let some of that sort of leak into the zeitgeist of the game. So in particular, those three examples are I think I'll call it good there. They're all it's all real stuff.
Okay.
You just have to go looking for it.
Okay.
So
sorry, one more.
Okay.
Did Wes Johnson create new lore? Wes Johnson, the voice actor, create new lore when he said that shivering cheese is made from Stilt Strider milk?
I love that stuff. I would say that just like as I, Michael Zenke, am just sitting here talking to you guys, I am not the voice for lore. I think that applies to everybody, right? Like we're just out here doing our thing, talking our talk. I love the relationship that Wes has with the characters that he kind of inhabits. He's such a passionate dude. It is awesome to watch him do his thing. So yeah, I loved all the stuff from the last couple of weeks. Voice of Palooza, like incredible, like super freaking fun. So
I suppose we'll make. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think you have one more question, and then Alio has one question, and then I think we'll finish up there.
Yeah, this is the last question from me from Reddit also. A user is asking, why are Daedric shrines absent from the Telvanni Peninsula?
That is a great question. So the easy answer is, here, I'll answer it this way. The Telvanni are very particular about what face that they present to the world, right? One of my favorite things I got to write for this release. Sorry, I wrote a bunch of things for this release I really like, but one of my favorite things is the actual letter that they sent to the Pact, the Covenant, and the Dominion, where they were like, politely screw yourselves. The way that they cultivate their image, right, in what they show and what they don't show, is something I think you should keep in mind as you traverse the peninsula, right? So within Necrom proper, within the city, because of the role of the city and the fact that the Keepers of the Dead are pretty much in control, although if the Telvanni had a problem with what the Keepers were doing, like I feel like there would be conflict there. But in the rest of the region and the rest of the zone, the Telvanni have been very cautious about how they present themselves to people visiting. So the way I would frame this is, you need to look carefully to try to find sort of the substrate stuff going on, right? Like, I don't, the fact that there aren't like really obvious, shrines to the four corners or whatever, right? Like that's absolutely true. That is a true thing. To say that there's no Daedric shrines at all, or that there's no Daedric worship at all, I'm not sure that that's accurate. So I would like try to look beneath the surface a little bit.
So they're just very subtle about it.
Okay, yeah, Ollie.
And then I guess just finally, obviously it's been a fascinating conversation, and it's definitely sort of piqued my interest in it. But coming from a person that's never been super invested in the lore and read too much about it, how would you explain to someone who knows nothing about the Elder Scrolls lore universe, someone coming to it brand new, what's it all about? What would be your movie pitch for why should people be interested in Elder Scrolls Online?
Absolutely.
Where do they start?
You should be interested in the Elder Scrolls as lore, as IP, because it's like the real world, only more so. Everything that you know and understand from like real life culture and politics and the challenges that we've lived as a species for the last, on and off 2,000, 3,000 years, right? Like that's there in Tamriel, only more so with dragons. And it's like history, but with dragons. That's my pitch. I genuinely think that like let's take Dark Elves as an example, right? Because they're coming up in Necrom. Dark Elves are like this like portable story unit in a bunch of different fantasy spaces, right? But generally speaking, they end up being sort of like, they have a bunch of traits that follow them from like place to place, stemming back to sort of their origin point. They usually really like spiders, as an example, right? Dark Elves love spiders. In Tamriel, everything's super specific. So even if like you've watched Lord of the Rings, say, right? You think you know about dwarves, like you have a vague understanding of what elves are about, right? Like Tamriel's going to surprise you, because man, do we have a bunch of stuff that's like never going to be mentioned by Tolkien. Like it's from a bunch of like very different, very creative minds that have built on and reference a lot of the work that's come before them. But the world that we inhabit when we play Elder Scrolls Online, the place that we're in when we're in Tamriel, is a very different, weirder, more complicated, I think more interesting place than some of the other depictions you're going to see of sort of fantasy, generic fantasy tropes. That's my pitch.
That's a great pitch. All right.
When's the movie coming out? Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the cinematic trailers, though, they could make a movie.
Yeah,
no?
it could be.
Blur is very good at their jobs.
Yeah.
So good. This wasn't even Blur this last time.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Really good.
All right, and I guess we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for answering these questions and taking the time out of your day. I know it's really soon, and then you're probably busy. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
You guys have been great. I hope folks enjoy playing. I mean, it's next week, right? Like, I hope people enjoy it.
Very exciting.
And I look forward to seeing what people think.
Yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
All right.
And hopefully...
Nice talking to you, everybody. Thanks, everybody.
Bye
See you.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you.